Hello my friends, welcome back to the channel. Today's video we're going to talk about the training and the lead up to Peaks Challenge, because I know I've had a few questions about how I trained for my first Peaks and how I got sub 10 hours. So we'll get into it. So realistically for Peaks I only gave myself 6 weeks to train because I signed up on a bit of a whim and didn't really think much of it beforehand. So let's backtrack to November last year where I did Ironman 70.3 Melbourne and I reached a long-term goal of mine, which was getting on the podium. After that, my desire to train and my, mental health around triathlon had sort of plummeted. I felt like I'd hit a goal, I'd hit this big peak, and then I was like, I'm not really sure what is next. Like, how much further can I push the needle on this sport? So I went into a bit of a low and spent a few weeks sort of not really training that much and not really knowing what my direction was going to be, which brought along road cycling. Now, obviously as a triathlete, I've spent a lot of time road cycling, but mostly riding a TT bike. I do have a road bike. However, I didn't really ride my road bike all that much because the focus was on riding strong on a TT bike in the aero position. So leading into summer, I started to go out on more outdoor rides, longer rides on my road bike, and I absolutely loved it. And then over Christmas, I decided that I was going to take on the festive 500, which is you have to ride 500 kilometers between the 24th of December and the 31st of December. The challenge so much harder, I decided to try and ride as much elevation as possible. And I think I hit nearly 9,000 meters of climbing before the challenge even finished. And I was getting a few questions from people about, oh, are you training for Peaks Challenge? Oh, you should do Peaks Challenge this year. And I sort of brushed off the thought and was not super invested in the idea. And then the more I thought about it and the more I rode, the more I was like, oh, this might actually be something fun for me to do and take my mind off triathlon. And it wasn't until, I'm going to say around January, that I sent a text message to my mate Matt and said, hey, want to do Peaks? And his reply to me was more or less a, fuck yeah, let's do it. So from there I was like, oh, okay, someone's going to do this with me, so I guess that means it's set in stone, let's do it. I reckon it was around mid-January, so I'm going to say by the time I actually committed to it mentally, not just over text message, I had around 6 or 7 weeks to train for the event. About 6 or 7 weeks out, I think the goal in my head was to try and hit around the same amount of elevation as Peaks each week, if not more, and hit around 300 to 400 kilometers of cycling. This was along with a little bit of running still and a little bit of swimming because I didn't want to throw triathlon completely to the wayside. From around mid-January, it was when I started to ride specifically for Peaks. So my weeks were structured around roughly 4 rides each week. 2 were on the indoor trainer, specific intervals or recovery type sessions. So one of my interval sessions might have been a mix of threshold intervals, zone 3 or zone 4, or might have been some VO2 max specific work. And those sessions usually range from an hour to 2 hours, somewhere in that vicinity. The recovery rides on the trainer were usually about an hour of zone 2 and zone 1 specific work. Then throughout the week, I also had a mid ride, which I would try to do outdoors. And that was usually around the 3-hour mark. And that ride was aimed at just no specific intervals, just go out and ride, get some hills in the legs, get some Ks in the legs, just get used to riding the road. For the main session, the holy grail was the epic long ride. And that started fairly controlled and built up to some sort of whack-ass ride by the time we got to Peaks. During those weeks, I was also running between 20 and 30 Ks and swimming about 6 Ks a week. I also would make sure to throw in at least 1 strength session every week, which would focus on compound movements and accessory movements, and also some upper body and core strength to keep everything strong for long days on the bike. So I've written down some of my main key rides because I'm filming on my phone and I can't check it right now. But around the 11th of January was when we kicked off with our first key ride. And that was 120 kilometres with 2,200 metres of elevation. And that was done around the Kinglake Glenburn area. Now, if you haven't been out to King Lake, it is about a 7-kilometre steady climb, around 3 to 4%. It's not all that hard, but if you've never climbed hills before, it is a bit of a kicker. About a week later, we bumped up from 110 to 160 kilometres. And that was what I called mini Three Peaks. And this is a combination of King Lake climb, King Lake back climb from Glenburn, and Hume-Vale. Now, Hume-Vale gets a big rap about it being this cool, awesome, tough climb, but really, it's easier than riding up King Lake, guys. Don't kid yourself, okay? It's only 3%, and it's not as long as King Lake. It is a nice climb though, don't get me wrong. It's pretty fun. Then from there, this is where things really pick up. And this was where we did our first epic ride, and it took us about 7.5 hours to do this ride. This was out at Mount Donabwang and Lake Mountain through Marysville. This was a ride, it was around 165 kilometres and around 3,200 metres of climbing in the one ride. So this is a big bump from the previous ride. And we started in Narberthong, which is a little country town, and we went out through Marysville, up Lake Mountain, which is a 21-kilometre climb. It is a very steady climb. I believe it's an average gradient of 5 to 6%. I'll put it up here for those wondering. And it's got a real kicker at the start. I feel like the first 5Ks is quite steep, maybe around a 7 or 8%, and then it sort of evens out. And it's a really nice climb. And I remember the first time we did that climb, we got to the top and we were like, wow, that was easy. And that's a good sign. But then we went back down Lake Mountain, through Reefton Spur, through Warburton, and then up Donabwang. Now, Donabwang is 16 kilometres, so it's not as far as Lake Mountain, but the average gradient is about 6 to 7%, and it bites. I can tell you it bites. That is a hard climb, especially when you're around 140 kilometres deep into a ride. So once we'd done Donabwang on that day, we came back down and we went through Acheron back to Narberthong. And now we knew there was a little bit of gravel on this route, but we didn't know that it was going to be 13 Ks of corrugated, slippery, cambered gravel. And I can tell you now, I was fighting for my life on every inch of that road. And I did not let go of the handlebars. And my hands were fully numb by the end of it and so sore. I was so grateful to get back to the sweet, sweet asphalt after that. So from there, we brought the Ks back down slightly. I did a couple of rides at Mount Macedon, which is out in the sort of northwestern suburbs. And Macedon is a short but very punchy climb. I believe there's 12-14% gradients in Mount Macedon, and a lot of it is more manageable, around the 5%, but it is a good bitey climb. If you're out northwest more, Mount Macedon is a very good climb to go and get some practice on. Now, the 18th of Feb, I believe we were 3 weeks out from the race at this point, roughly. This is where we did the Big Mama. The ride that definitely changed me. I'm going to call it character development. This was another ride out east, up Lake Mountain and up Donabwang. However, this time, instead of the ride being 160 kilometres, it was almost 180 kilometres, and we added 1,000 metres of elevation to this ride. So we started this time in Warburton, not Narberthong, and we rode from Warburton out past Lake Mountain to Marysville, did a U-bolt, went up Lake Mountain, back down, back to Warburton, and up Mount Donabwang. Now, for the majority of this ride, it was pretty chill. We're having a great time. It was fun. It was sunny. It was around 25 degrees, 26 degrees, until we hit Mount Donabwang. And I distinctly remember about halfway up, it felt like this fog had settled in. It was like that drizzly rain, the fog had set in, and it had gone from 25 degrees to about 12 degrees, and we were soaking wet. And we'd gone up to the top of this climb and we were shivering, and then we had to come back down in the fog. I could not see for the life of me. My glasses I had to take off. I was going so slow because I couldn't see and I could barely hold my handlebar. It really made me question my life choices. Once we got back down Mount Donabwang, it was pretty much back to the car, and it was the best time of my life, getting back to the car. I was freezing. From there, the ride started to drop back down because now, around 2 weeks out, is where you want to start tapering for an event like Peaks or a full Ironman or a half Ironman. Over the next few weeks, the rides dropped back in distance. Now, I'm sure if you were gunning for a sub 9, not a sub 10, then you would probably want to bump those Ks up to maybe 450 to 500 kilometers a week. and probably bump up the intensity. So for all of our long rides, the intensity was kept at a manageable rate. The shorter interval sessions is where you would push the needle of performance and try and get those harder, more intense reps out. Whereas these long rides were just about time in the saddle, getting the climbing into the legs, getting the Ks into the legs, practicing nutrition, and really just surviving. Trying to get your downstairs vision, the vagine, used to sitting in the saddle for that long. Because I can tell you now, 8.5 hours on the bike is a long time for the girls to be squashed up, if you know what I'm saying. I don't know how it is for you boys, but it's a long time. The thing I want to talk about for peaks is nutrition and what you should be looking at for fueling for a race of this sort of caliber and duration. So I based my race on around 80 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and I based my fluid on sort of more to feel, but roughly trying to get one 600ml bottle in each hour. In the early parts of the race, so probably in the first 3 hours, I didn't drink that much because it was quite cool and you don't want to be needing to go to the toilet all the time. So the main things you want to focus on with nutrition is trying to find something that works for you. Everybody is different, okay? You can get nutrition in from a range of different things, whether that be gels, a carbohydrate drink mix, bananas, hopefully not this brown, bars or chews or whites, lollies, and even sandwiches or bread, that sort of thing. I'll talk about specifically what I did for peaks, and you can either practice this, you can try it for yourself, or you can make up your own version. And the key with nutrition is trying to find things that aren't going to sit heavy in your gut, that are going to absorb very quickly into the bloodstream, and not overcomplicating things. Don't have too many things that will mix poorly and upset your stomach. The simplest form of carbohydrates you can find generally are going to be the best options for you. Okay, so for me, coming from triathlon, I always generally will focus on 80 to 90 grams of carbs whilst on a bike ride. So, and this is in a race. So that is what I base peaks off, which meant that I needed around 800 grams of carbs if I'm aiming for the 10-hour mark, roughly. Okay. Just because you put a number out there doesn't mean you need to stick to it. Obviously, base it off how you're feeling as well. Don't overdo it. Try not to underdo it. Either way, overdoing it or underdoing is not a good thing. To start off with, I use the Pure Sports Nutrition Carb and Electrolyte Mix. This is, I think it's called Electrolyte Hydration. This is, per scoop, you get 12.5 grams of carbohydrates with 100 milligrams of sodium. And this comes in a bunch of different flavors. So for me, I put 4 scoops in a 650, 700 ml bottle. That will get me 50 grams of carbs and 400 milligrams of sodium. So this is something that I've used for a very long time, and I know it sits well with me. I've tried other. Obviously, I started off with 2 bottles on the bike. I swapped out a bottle at the first stop, which was Harriettville. I picked up another bottle at the first stop, which was Harriettville. Then I had another 2 bottles at Dinner Plain. So that worked out to be 6 bottles with this fuel over the 10 hours. So that works out to be 300 grams of carbs. My next main source of fuel was sandwiches, and this was something that I wanted to take on earlier in the ride. And I had 3 sandwiches with honey. The bread I'm going to put up here because it's higher in carbs and also has a little bit of protein in it, and it is a spelt sourdough, so it's very easy on your gut to absorb. And I had 3 of those sandwiches. The bread on its own was 31 grams, and then with honey, you're adding about 15 to 20 grams there. So they worked out to be around 45 grams each. My next main source of fuel was bananas, and I had 2 bananas over the duration of the race. Again, trying to keep them earlier on in the ride. Bananas are around 30 grams of carbs each. My next source of fuel, which I started taking on later in the ride, were gels. And the gels that I was taking at the time are 25 grams each. And what I did was, so I put them all in these bottles and I put them at the rest stops so I could take on about 5 gels in this bottle and then have another one at the next rest stop. And I also had some spare gels as well. The other thing that I had were these power cookies or power bites. These are around 20 grams of carbs each, and I had 2 of these again earlier on in the ride. The 3 aid stations I utilized, and I had more food at each aid station, and then I try and eat it all, consume it all, and then swap out and get fresh stuff at the next aid station. You do have your own like little aid station bags at the rest stops where you can grab your nutrition. So that brought the total up to around the 700 mark, and that's pretty much what I took either on myself or put in my aid station bags. And then once we got to Trap Yard Gap, which was the last stop of the day, I downed a Coke. And I don't know how many grams of carbs a Coke is, but the moral support from the Coke was probably more than what the carbs did, and the sugar. It's a massive sugar and caffeine hit just to get you those last 30 Ks or so to the finish line. During training, I did experiment with things like fruit sticks, Arnott shapes, different sorts of lollies, and I just found too many different things upset my gut, and yeah, it was not a good time on the training rides. I work closely with a naturopath, sports naturopath, and she suggested to cut a lot of things out and also change to the sandwiches. I did, and then my training rides were so much better, and race day I had no gut problems. I didn't bonk, I fueled well enough, I drank enough. That's all she wrote. Obviously, weather dependent on whether you're going to drink more or drink less. I carried extra gels as well, just in case if the conditions weren't ideal for drinking 6 bottles of water. Again, the most important thing to do is go out in your long training rides, practice your nutrition and see how it sits in your gut. The last thing you want to do is get to race day and have never practiced your nutrition and just wing it and end up shitting yourself. Or bonking, or not having enough sodium, or having too much sodium. Please go and practice this in your training rides. Take a bunch of different things that you think you might want to try and see what works best for you. If there is anything specific that you want to know about peaks and the training for peaks, please drop me a comment and let me know. I can definitely make more videos on this, or I can just reply to your comment, whatever's easiest, whatever you prefer. For the meantime, don't forget to watch my weekly vlogs for training for the Ironman Australia, and I will see you in the next video. Like and subscribe. Bye!